Hello, guys. Welcome you all to the Insights into Books podcast, where we discuss insights of significant books, which changes our lives. But before we start the discussion on today's book, kindly subscribe or follow Insights into Books for regular updates. With the hope that you have subscribed, let's start today's discussion. Today, we're embarking on a fascinating journey, a deep dive into Malcolm Gladwell's thought-provoking book, Talking to Strangers. What we should know about the people we don't know. Now, this isn't just another book about, making small talk or social skills. Gladwell really delves into a fundamental human challenge that honestly touches all our lives. Our inherent difficulty in truly understanding and, effectively engaging with people we encounter who are outside our familiar circle. It's a pretty bold claim, isn't it? That despite all our social advancements, all our technology connecting us, we're actually quite bad at this basic human thing. What do you think? What exactly is Gladwell's central mission with this idea? Why does he believe this is such a critical flaw in how we navigate the world today?
That's precisely the core of it. Yeah, Gladwell's mission in Talking to Strangers is to meticulously unpack and really shine a spotlight on the deep-seated, often unconscious reasons why these interactions with people we don't know, why they so frequently go awry. And he's not just talking about minor social missteps or, those awkward silences we all experience. He's highlighting how these flaws, these built-in errors, lead to profoundly significant errors in judgment, errors that can escalate into serious conflicts and, in some truly tragic instances, even fatal outcomes. I mean, think about it. In our modern, hyper-connected world, you're constantly interacting with strangers, right? Whether it's through a screen, a quick encounter buying coffee, or maybe a more formal professional meeting, these encounters are not just common, they're basically constant.
Yeah, they really are everywhere, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, given this reality, understanding these fundamental flaws in our ingrained, let's call them social strategies for dealing with strangers, well, understanding them isn't just interesting, it's absolutely crucial for how we function, both as individuals and really as a society. He argues quite forcefully that our default ways of interacting are, in many cases, doubly flawed, and that understanding those flaws is really the essential first step toward maybe navigating these critical interactions a bit better.
That's a powerful and honestly somewhat unsettling premise he starts with. So, okay, let's really unpack this. Gladwell isn't just pointing out a problem saying, hey, we're bad at this. He's taking us on a deep dive, you said, into the psychological blind spots that often lead us astray. So where does he suggest we start in understanding this whole stranger problem? What's the foundational flaw, the first big piece of the puzzle that underpins so many of our misunderstandings?
Right, well, Gladwell begins by introducing a concept that's almost counterintuitive in its simplicity. Yet it has these profound impacts. It's what he calls the default to truth theory. And this isn't just Gladwell's idea. It's a foundational psychological principle, really championed by the psychologist Tim Levine. The theory basically posits that as humans, our natural inclination, our default setting, if you will, is to operate with an inherent assumption that other people are being truthful. We start from a place of belief. It's an incredibly powerful and often totally unconscious bias that shapes pretty much every initial interaction you have with someone new.
So we're wired to believe. That seems almost, naive, doesn't it? Especially considering, everything we see in the news, the world we live in.
Yeah.
But I can also see how it would be essential for just getting through the day. Can you elaborate a bit more on why this default is so deeply ingrained and what its broader implications are, both the good and the bad sides?
You've absolutely hit on the crux of the paradox there. What's truly fascinating, and what Gladwell explores so well, is how this mechanism, which is absolutely essential for society's functioning, can simultaneously be a profound vulnerability. It makes us incredibly susceptible to deception. I mean, think about it. Doubt, skepticism, or just plain suspicion. Those feelings only truly arise when the evidence against someone being truthful becomes, as Levine puts it, definitive. And that, as Gladwell emphasizes throughout the book, is a very, very high threshold to cross in most situations.
Right. Definitive evidence is hard to come by usually.
Exactly. For the vast majority of our daily interactions, ordering food, asking for directions, collaborating with colleagues, this default tendency isn't just beneficial, it's vital. Could you imagine trying to live in a world where every single statement, every email, every interaction required you to first critically scrutinize it for potential lies?
It would be exhausting.
Sounds
Paralyzing, really.
completely paralyzing. Communication would just grind to a halt. Social harmony, forget about it. Our entire systems of commerce, law, even just casual conversation, they all rely on this underlying assumption of truthfulness. It's the grease that keeps the wheels turning. So it's a sensible default, as Gladwell calls it. It promotes efficient communication, lets us build relationships, build societies. However, and this is the big however, it's this very efficiency, this very sensibility that creates significant blind spots, especially when we encounter someone who is intent on manipulating or deceiving us. We're simply not geared to expect it because most of the time people are telling the truth or at least trying to.
That makes perfect sense. We absolutely need to trust a function day to day. But then, like you said, it leaves us wide open. And Gladwell brings this to life with some truly compelling and, frankly, quite chilling case studies. The story of Ana Montes is one that really sticks with you, doesn't it? Here's this highly respected intelligence analyst, the Queen of Cuba, they called her, inside the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. And for years, secretly, she was a Cuban spy, handing over immensely damaging U.S. secrets. How does her story illuminate this default to truth principle so starkly?
Oh, Ana Montes' story is just a stark, almost unbelievable illustration of the default to truth in action. And crucially, in action even within the highest echelons of national security, a place you'd think would be immune. Here was a woman operating within an agency, the DIA, whose very purpose is to identify threats and deception. Yet she managed to evade detection for an astonishing 17 years. 17! Gladwell meticulously details how she pulled this off, essentially by being outwardly exemplary. A model employee?
Oh, perfectly.
Perfectly. She was dedicated. She worked incredibly long hours. Her analyses were considered brilliant. She built this facade of trustworthiness. But looking back, throughout those 17 years, there were numerous red flags, small things, inconsistencies, unusual behaviors. Even a polygraph test that, in retrospect, definitely raised questions. Yet, because of the powerful default to truth, these were consistently rationalized away, ignored, explained. Her colleagues, her superiors, even, this is astounding, her own sister and brother, who were both FBI agents, and her boyfriend, a Pentagon specialist in Latin American intelligence.
People who should have been the most suspicious, arguably.
You think so?
Yeah.
But they all defaulted to believing her truthfulness. They saw her quirks not as potential signs of deception, but as dedication. Her rigid routines weren't suspicious. They were signs of discipline. They dismissed their own fleeting suspicions because there wasn't that definitive evidence needed to cross that incredibly high threshold of doubt. This case just dramatically drives home the point that our misunderstanding isn't just limited to complete strangers on the street. It extends powerfully to those we believe we know well, especially when we have an existing framework of trust already built up around them.
It's just incredible how that framework of trust can act like blinders.
Wow. And then, shifting gears from national security to the world of high finance, we have the notorious Bernie Madoff. His Ponzi scheme defrauded countless investors of billions of dollars. It was just staggering. What's so striking, as Gladwell points out, is that many people on Wall Street, the insiders, actually did have suspicions about Madoff for years. They thought his returns were maybe too good to be true. So how did he manage to keep this massive deception going for so long if people were already kind of wary? How did the default to truth play out there?
Madoff was an absolute master at leveraging the default to true, particularly when he was confronted, when people did raise those doubts. When suspicions arose, he wouldn't just issue a flat denial. No, he would offer plausible, often very sophisticated-sounding explanations for his unusual, consistently high returns or his famously opaque operations.
He'd smooth things over. Exactly. He'd smooth things over with jargon or appeals to his reputation. And people, even really savvy investors and supposedly vigilant financial regulators, they heard his explanations and, operating under that deeply ingrained default to truth, they accepted them as sufficient. They wanted to believe. Gladwell really highlights how many just assumed that in such a highly regulated financial market, or what they thought was highly regulated, that someone was paying attention.
Right, trust in the system itself.
Trust in the system, trust in the SEC, trust that someone else must have checked this out. They trusted the system, and by extension, they trusted the prominent individuals operating successfully within it, like Madoff. And in doing so, they overlooked clear warning signs. Signs that, to someone like Harry Markopoulos, the independent fraud investigator Gladwell profiles were just screaming fraud. Markopoulos is fascinating because he was unique precisely because he didn't default to truth with Madoff. He actively, relentlessly looked for inconsistencies. He tried to replicate Madoff's supposed trading strategies and quickly found them to be mathematically impossible.
He was the exception.
He was the exception, the holy fool, we'll maybe talk about later, but for everyone else. Well, if we connect this Madoff situation to the bigger picture, it just highlights how systemic trust, while absolutely necessary for markets to function, can inadvertently provide this powerful shield for deception. It makes it incredibly difficult for individuals, even those harboring private doubts, to penetrate that shield and expose the lie. The system kind of protects the liar.
It's truly terrifying how deeply ingrained this default is, and how easily, how systematically it can be exploited. And this inherent trust, this willingness to believe the best, as Gladwell explores. It also played a devastating role in some truly disturbing cases involving vulnerable individuals. Specifically, he looks at the cases of Jerry Sandusky, the former Penn State football coach, and Larry Nassar, the USA gymnastics doctor, both eventually convicted of horrific abuse of children over many years. How does the default to truth help illuminate the failures, the missed signals surrounding these awful situations?
Yeah, these cases are particularly heartbreaking, aren't they? Precisely because they involve figures who held positions of immense trust and authority over young people. Gladwell argues, quite persuasively I think, that a critical factor in how long both Sandusky and Nassar were able to operate unchallenged was the pervasive default to truth among the adults around them, university staff, coaches, parents, sports officials, you name it. It became incredibly difficult, almost psychologically impossible for many people to believe the horrific accusations being leveled against such trusted, admired, even beloved figures. They were pillars of their communities.
The image just didn't match the accusation.
Exactly. The image was too strong. So when initial reports or suspicions did emerge, they were often framed or perceived in ways that allowed that default to truth to persist. They were minimized, rationalized. For instance, in Sandusky's case, Gladwell points to reports describing incidents not as clear abuse, but as ambiguous horseplay or inappropriate touching. These softer descriptions provided an easier, less disturbing explanation, enabling others, perhaps unconsciously, to maintain their belief in his innocence, or at least his good intentions. It allowed them to avoid confronting the monstrous reality. And it raises an important and deeply uncomfortable question for you, for all of us to consider. At what point does a sensible default, the kind of trust that allows society to function, at what point does it tip over into becoming a culpable oversight? A failure to protect, especially when the stakes are so incredibly high for vulnerable individuals who depend on adults to see the truth. It really underscores this challenging tension between the necessity of societal trust and the absolute imperative to protect the innocent from harm.
That's a profoundly unsettling thought. That line between sensible trust and culpable oversight. It's blurry. So, okay, if most of us are wired to default to truth, and it can have such terrible consequences in these extreme cases, how do deceptions ever actually come to light? Gladwell introduces this fascinating concept. You mentioned him briefly earlier, the holy fool. Individuals like Harry Markopolos, the Madoff whistleblower. These are people who seem to operate with a completely different sense of the possibility of deception, people who simply don't default to truth in the same way. Tell us more about them.
You're right. These holy fools, as Gladwell colorfully describes them, are indeed rare. They're almost like statistical anomalies in the population. They seem to possess this unique capacity for skepticism, a different threshold for doubt, maybe, and often an unwavering commitment to facts and evidence, even when those facts challenge deeply held beliefs or comfortable societal narratives. While society absolutely needs the default to truth to function efficiently day to day, it also desperately needs these individuals, these outliers. They perform an incredibly valuable, although often thankless and difficult function. They challenge the status quo.
They rock the boat.
They absolutely rock the boat. They are the ones willing to meticulously scrutinize the details, to actively look for inconsistencies where others see none, to challenge assumptions everyone else takes for granted. And ultimately, they expose fraud and deceit, often sacrificing their own personal comfort, their professional standing, sometimes even their own peace of mind in the process. It takes a toll. Markopolos, for example, spent years, literally years, trying to get regulators at the SEC to listen to his evidence about Madoff, often being dismissed, ignored, or even ridiculed.
That must have been incredibly frustrating.
Immensely. So, what does this all mean for you listening to this? It suggests, I think, a delicate but absolutely critical balance. We need the societal glue of trust for daily life to flow smoothly. But we also rely, perhaps more than we realize, on the vigilance of these rare individuals who are willing to question that trust, even when it feels counterintuitive or uncomfortable, to detect genuine threats and expose those who exploit our inherent good faith. It's about recognizing that both roles, the trusting majority and the skeptical few, are essential, even if they appear to be fundamentally in opposition. We need both.
That's a really powerful distinction, the sort of necessary tension between the trusting default and the skeptical holy fool. Now, moving on from our default to truth, Gladwell uncovers another crucial flaw in how we perceive strangers. This one feels very intuitive, actually. It's what he calls the limitations of transparency, or what he maybe more memorably labels the friends fallacy. This is our mistaken yet deeply ingrained belief that people's outward behavior, their demeanor, their body language, their facial expressions, reliably and transparently reflect their inner feelings and true intentions, like they're an open book.
Oh, this is a concept that resonates so deeply, doesn't it? Because you see this assumption everywhere, especially baked into popular culture, TV shows, movies. What's truly fascinating here, and slightly amusing, is how much we unconsciously expect other people to be like TV characters, clearly broadcasting their internal states for us to easily read. Gladwell uses the friends fallacy as this perfect metaphor, drawing a direct contrast with the incredibly popular sitcom Friends. In that show, think about it, the characters' emotions are always crystal clear, completely legible. Rachel's happiness or disappointment, Chandler's sarcasm, Joey's confusion, it's all written plainly on their faces and exaggerated in their gestures.
Yeah, you never doubt what they're feeling.
Never. The audience knows precisely what they're feeling, often even before they say anything. It's designed that way for comedic effect and clarity. But real life, Gladwell argues forcefully, is profoundly different. It's far more complex, much more nuanced, and significantly less transparent than a sitcom. People are generally not open books, and our deep-seated assumption that they are leads us down a path of frequent, sometimes disastrous misinterpretation. We want to believe we can simply look at someone and know what's going on inside their head or heart, but the actual evidence suggests that's often just wishful thinking.
That's a great analogy of the Friends thing, because we really do internalize those kinds of clear, exaggerated signals from media, don't we? And it turns out our basic assumptions about universal facial expressions and the easy readability of emotions might be fundamentally flawed. Gladwell points to some fascinating, maybe even controversial research in this area, like studies conducted by Sergio Trebillo and Carlos Crivelli in the Trobriand Islands and Mozambique, and also Maria Gendron in Namibia. What did these cross-cultural studies reveal about our supposedly universal ability to read emotions from faces?
Well, these were groundbreaking studies because they really challenged our largely Western-centric understanding of emotional expression, which has long assumed universality. What they revealed was quite striking. People from isolated non-Western cultures like the Trobriand Islanders or the Himba in Namibia often struggled significantly to identify emotions like anger, fear, or disgust from facial cues that Westerners easily recognized and labeled as universal. For example, some Trobrianders, when shown a photograph of a Western face displaying what we'd call a standard angry expression, sometimes interpreted it as happiness or maybe aggression, but not necessarily anger in the specific way we understand it.
Wow, so not universal at all then.
It strongly suggests that emotional expressions might be far more culturally specific, more learned than previously thought. Maybe not universally transparent signals after all. And it's not just about cultural differences either. Gladwell also highlights studies, like one by Schutzwohl and Reisenstein, where people dramatically overestimated their own expressivity, how well they showed their feelings. Most subjects in one experiment rated their surprise at an event like a loud noise at an average of 8 out of 10 on a scale. They genuinely believed their face showed it clearly. Yet when researchers objectively analyzed photos, only about 5% actually exhibited the stereotypical surprise face. Wide eyes, raised eyebrows, dropped jaw, just 5%.
That's a huge disconnect.
Huge. So this raises a really important question for you to ponder. If even basic emotions aren't universally expressed or perceived in the ways we assume, and we can't even accurately gauge our own expressions, how can we possibly hope to accurately read strangers based solely on their demeanor? We're often trying to decipher a language we don't truly understand or one that's being spoken differently, leading to frequent and sometimes serious miscommunications.
Okay, so not only do we wrongly default to believing people are telling the truth, but we also mistakenly believe their internal states are easily visible on the surface. Double whammy. And this, as Gladwell illustrates so powerfully, leads directly to the problem of mismatched individuals. These are, as he describes them, honest people who, for various reasons, maybe nerves, maybe cultural background, maybe just personality, appear suspicious or untrustworthy. And conversely, you have the liars, the deceivers, who master the art of appearing perfectly trustworthy and sincere. This isn't just a theoretical idea, is it? It has profound real-world consequences, particularly in high-stakes situations like law enforcement or legal settings.
Absolutely profound consequences. Gladwell highlights how this mismatch phenomenon can lead to severe, life-altering misjudgments, even among professionals specifically trained to detect deception. He cites a particularly striking study involving experienced law enforcement agents. Now, when these agents were dealing with matched individuals, that is, liars who acted nervously or evasively like stereotypical liars, or truth-tellers who appeared calm and open like stereotypical truth-tellers, the agents were 100% accurate, spot on. their instincts and training worked perfectly.
Okay, so far so good.
Right. But then came the mismatched cases. The honest person who, for whatever reason, appeared suspicious, maybe fidgeted or avoided eye contact, or the smooth, convincing deceiver who appeared utterly sincere. In those cases, the agent's accuracy plummeted dramatically to a mere 20%. 20%.
That's worse than chance. That's just guessing, basically, and getting it wrong most of the time.
Pretty much. They were essentially guessing and mostly getting it wrong. It shows just how much our ingrained reliance on demeanor, on perceived transparency, as a reliable indicator of honesty is often profoundly flawed. It makes us dangerously bad at identifying both truth and deception in those individuals who don't neatly fit our preconceived notions of what an honest or dishonest person looks like or acts like. This is a critical blind spot, a major vulnerability that can have devastating implications in the real world.
And a truly poignant, widely debated, and frankly tragic example of this mismatch leading to catastrophic misjudgment is the case of Amanda Knox. She was a young American student accused of murdering her roommate Meredith Kircher while studying in Italy. After years of legal battles and intense global media scrutiny, she was eventually fully acquitted by Italy's highest court. How does Gladwell use her incredibly complex and sensitive story to illustrate the dangers of the friends fallacy and this idea of mismatched individuals?
Amanda Knox's case, as Gladwell recounts and analyzes it, serves as a stark and deeply disturbing example of how our powerful expectations of transparency, our belief that emotion should be obvious, can completely derail justice. By most accounts, Knox was undeniably quirky. Her behavior in the immediate aftermath of her roommate's horrific murder was certainly unconventional, maybe even weird by some cultural standards. You mentioned some of it earlier. She was seen kissing her then-boyfriend, Raffaele Salcido, outside the crime scene. She bought red underwear the next day because, importantly, she couldn't access her crime scene apartment for clean clothes. And she even reportedly did yoga poses or stretches in the police station while waiting, possibly at the request of an officer to pass the time.
Behaviors that just seemed off to many people watching.
Exactly. They seemed off because the police, the media, and much of the public expected a very specific, stereotypical, transparent display of profound grief and distress from someone in her situation. Tears, shock, withdrawal. When Knox didn't conform to this narrow, culturally conditioned expectation of how an innocent person should act, her unconventional demeanor was dramatically misinterpreted. It wasn't seen as shock or confusion, but as a clear sign of cold-blooded guilt, a lack of remorse. Gladwell argues she was a classic mismatched individual, an innocent person whose perfectly normal, albeit perhaps unusual for the circumstances, coping mechanisms and personality traits were wrongly interpreted as definitive evidence of her culpability.
The interpretation was everything.
Everything. And this deeply ingrained misinterpretation of her supposed lack of transparency, he contends, led directly to what he calls a shockingly inept investigation. An investigation that seemed to prioritize these perceived emotional cues, this mismatch, over a severe lack of concrete physical evidence linking her directly to the crime. The result, as we know, was years of wrongful imprisonment, immense public condemnation based on this perceived persona, and a family's life turned upside down. It's a powerful cautionary lesson in how our assumptions about how people should act, how transparent they should be, can completely blind us to the actual facts, to the truth.
It's truly horrifying how easily a deviation from expected behavior, from expected transparency, can be weaponized against someone, especially in such a high-profile case. And this friends fallacy, this belief we can read people, isn't just about criminal justice. Gladwell even takes us back to a pivotal historical encounter to illustrate its dangers. He revisits the meetings between the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler in 1938 concerning the Sudetenland crisis in Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain famously returned to Britain waving a piece of paper, believing he had secured peace in our time based on Hitler's assurances. What was Gladwell's analysis of this monumental, world-altering misjudgment?
Yeah, this example is fascinating because here's where it gets really interesting and maybe counterintuitive again. Personal interaction, face-to-face meeting in this profound historical moment actually seems to have made Chamberlain worse at understanding the stranger Hitler rather than better, which goes against everything we normally assume.
We think meeting someone tells us more, right?
We absolutely think that. Chamberlain, who was largely a businessman with relatively limited foreign policy experience, specifically chose to meet Hitler face-to-face multiple times. He flew to Germany. He genuinely believed that by looking Hitler in the eyes, by engaging in direct conversation, by assessing his demeanor, he could discern the man's true intentions. He thought he could read him, and he came away utterly convinced. convinced he had established certain confidence in Hitler's word, leading to that infamous declaration upon his return to Britain, "Peace in our time." Gladwell emphasizes this point. Chamberlain looked at Hitler long and hard and decided he believed him. He relied on his perception of Hitler's transparency. He saw what he perhaps wanted or expected to see.
Yeah.
A fellow leader, maybe volatile, but someone with whom he could ultimately reason.
And he was disastrously wrong.
Disastrously. Hitler, of course, broke his promise just months later, invading the rest of Czechoslovakia, setting the stage for World War II. Now, contrast this, as Gladwell does, with Winston Churchill. Churchill never met Hitler personally. His assessment was based purely on Hitler's written words in Mein Kampf, his public speeches, and his documented actions. And based on that non-personal information, Churchill consistently and correctly believed Hitler was fundamentally untrustworthy and posed an existential threat.
So the distance actually helped Churchill see more clearly.
It seems so in this case. This historical example highlights a critical paradox. We inherently believe personal interaction provides uniquely valuable information about a stranger. We think getting up close helps. Yet sometimes it can actively mislead us. It can reinforce our existing biases, our cultural expectations, our hopes, rather than offering true insight into their character or, more importantly, their intentions. It's a really powerful lesson in the severe limitations of relying on perceived transparency, especially when dealing with a masterful manipulator and deceiver like Hitler. Sometimes the signals we get face-to-face are just noise, or worse, deliberate misdirection.
That's a deeply sobering thought, that our very attempts to get closer to understanding someone, to bridge that gap, can actually move us further away from the truth sometimes. Wow. All right, let's explore another profound insight Gladwell presents, which shifts the focus somewhat. It's quite distinct from our internal biases about truth and transparency. This is the idea of coupling theory and context. Quote, "This idea suggests that human behaviors are not just about the individual person, their character or disposition, but are strongly, maybe even primarily, linked to very specific circumstances and conditions, the situation they're in. Essentially, we often fail to understand the crucial role that context plays in a stranger's actions, and instead of examining the situation, the environment, we mistakenly just blame the stranger."
Precisely. And this represents a fundamental shift in perspective that Gladwell really urges you, the listener, to adopt when trying to understand puzzling or disturbing behavior. We have a very common, almost intuitive belief in what psychologists sometimes call displacement. It's the assumption that if you stop someone from doing X in this particular place or situation, they'll simply find another way or place to do X. The behavior is inherent to the person, not the place.
Like Crime Stop It Here just moves down the block.
Right. Exactly that kind of thinking. But coupling theory directly challenges this common assumption. It argues that many significant behaviors are tightly coupled to specific environments, specific contexts, or specific conditions. The behavior belongs to the circumstances as much as, or even more than, it belongs to the person. So instead of reflexively asking, what's wrong with that person, when you see something troubling, Gladwell pushes you to ask a different question. What's wrong with that person's world? What's going on in their environment? He emphasizes repeatedly that we should not look at the stranger and jump to conclusions based on their actions alone. Instead, we need to look at the stranger's world, because context, he argues, powerfully influences your interpretation of who the stranger is. It fundamentally reorients our focus away from purely inherent individual characteristics, like good or bad, towards the powerful, often overlooked environmental forces that shape behavior. And importantly, this isn't about excusing bad behavior, but about understanding its origins more deeply, more accurately, which might lead to better solutions.
That's a really critical distinction. It shifts the focus from solely internal factors, personality, morality, to the powerful influence of external situational factors. And Gladwell illustrates this coupling concept with some truly thought-provoking and sometimes surprising examples. He starts with the difficult topic of suicide prevention. He delves into the historical link between suicide rates and the ready availability of lethal methods, referencing the poignant stories of poets like Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, both of whom tragically died by carbon monoxide poisoning from domestic town gas, which was common then. How does this connect specifically to coupling theory?
The data Gladwell presents on this is quite compelling and stark, actually. He highlights research showing how suicide rates in England and Wales experienced a significant and rather dramatic plunge down, his words, by about 33% when poisonous coal-based town gas was systematically replaced by non-toxic natural gas across the country in the late 1960s and early 70s. Now, while there might have been some underlying decline in suicide rates starting earlier for other reasons, the sheer scale and abruptness of the drop immediately following the gas conversion strongly supports the idea of coupling. It suggests that the availability of that specific, lethal, and easily accessible method right there in the home environment was a crucial factor in many suicides. It wasn't simply the people who wanted to die would find any way to do so. The particular method, tied intimately to the domestic context, made it significantly more likely for some.
So removing that specific method didn't just cause displacement, it reduced the overall rate.
Exactly. It didn't seem to cause widespread displacement to other methods, at least not enough to offset the drop. The overall rate went down significantly. Similarly, he cites a very powerful study by Richard Seiden focusing on individuals who were physically restrained from jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, which was, and sadly still is, a notorious suicide spot. Seiden tracked 515 individuals who were physically prevented from jumping over several decades. A follow-up study years later found that only 25 of them, that's less than 5%, subsequently committed suicide by another method.
Wow, only 5%. That's incredibly low.
Incredibly low. It's a profound finding, suggesting that for many, perhaps most of those individuals, the decision to commit suicide is coupled to that particular bridge. The impulse, the plan, was tied to that specific place and method. It really raises an important question for you to consider. How profoundly does our immediate environment and the specific opportunities or challenges it presents shape even our most desperate actions? And conversely, how can relatively simple contextual changes, like changing the gas supply or putting up bridge barriers, literally save lives by decoupling the impulse from the readily available means? It forces us to move beyond simply labeling someone as inherently suicidal and to examine the complex interaction between their internal state and their very specific external world.
That's a really powerful argument for focusing on changing environments and access to means, rather than solely focusing on individual pathology or willpower. It suggests some critical actions are not easily displaced if the specific coupling is broken. And this concept of coupling, of behavior being tied to place, also applies strongly to crime, doesn't it? Gladwell talks about something called the law of crime concentration, which reveals that crime isn't evenly distributed across our communities, as many people might intuitively assume. It clusters.
Absolutely. The coupling theory extends powerfully and I think very usefully to our understanding of crime patterns and prevention. Gladwell draws heavily on the influential work of criminologists like David Weisburd and Larry Sherman, who really established this law of crime concentration. Their findings, replicated across numerous cities and countries, are quite striking and consistent. Crime, far from being evenly spread out, is extremely concentrated geographically. It clusters in a tiny percentage of specific street segments, blocks, or addresses, what they call hotspots. In Minneapolis, for example, one study found that a mere 3.3% of street segments accounted for a staggering 50% of all calls for police service. Half the crime in 3% of the places.
That's an incredible concentration.
It really is. And this isn't an anomaly. Similar incredibly skewed distributions have been observed in Seattle, Boston, Tel Aviv, many major cities worldwide. Crime is sticky, it likes certain places. Furthermore, Gladwell highlights the Jersey City Displacement and Diffusion Study, which provided crucial evidence against the simple displacement theory in crime, the idea that if you crack down here, crime just pops up over there. In that study, when police aggressively targeted and policed a specific known prostitution hotspot, the researchers found that most of the sex workers involved preferred to leave prostitution entirely rather than simply moving their activities to a nearby street.
So again, the behavior was coupled to the place, not easily moved.
Exactly. It demonstrates quite unequivocally in that context that certain types of crime, much like suicide perhaps, can be strongly anchored to place. It's coupled to the specific opportunities, risks, and social dynamics of that particular environment. It's not just about inherently bad people who would commit crimes anywhere, anytime. It's often about specific environments that foster, facilitate, or fail to prevent certain types of criminal activity. So what does this all mean for you when you think about crime in your community? It fundamentally reorients our understanding. It pushes us from focusing solely on the individual bad actor, the stranger committing the crime, to recognizing the powerful and often overlooked influence of specific environments and contexts. It shifts the crucial question from who is this stranger to what is the stranger's world like and how is it enabling this behavior?
That's a profound shift in perspective, definitely. Moving from purely individual blame towards considering systemic and environmental factors. And this brings us, unfortunately, to a crucial and deeply tragic case that Gladwell uses to tie several of these ideas together. The default to truth, the transparency illusion, and especially this neglect of context or coupling. I'm talking about the 2015 traffic stop and subsequent death in custody of Sandra Bland, an African-American woman in Waller County, Texas. She was initially pulled over by Officer Brian Encina for a minor traffic violation, failing to signal a lane change. How does Gladwell dissect this incredibly painful and controversial event through the lens of his theories about talking to strangers?
Gladwell analyzes Sandra Bland's arrest and subsequent death not as a simple case of individual malice or racism, though those elements might be present, but more fundamentally as a collective failure. A failure stemming directly from flawed policing strategies that profoundly neglected the principle of coupling and were also deeply infected by the transparency illusion. He explains that Officer Encina had been trained in a relatively new, highly aggressive policing technique. This technique, partly inspired by the perceived successes of the Kansas City gun experiment, which involved intense proactive policing focused on specific high-crime areas to significantly reduce gun violence, encouraged officers to use minor traffic stops as pretexts.
Pretext stops, right.
Pretext stops. To stop motorists for minor violations and then aggressively look for signs of more serious criminal activity, essentially assuming every driver might be hiding something, like drugs or weapons, sort of a fishing expedition. The crucial mistake, Gladwell argues forcefully, was applying this high-intensity, needle-in-a-haystack tactic designed for dense, high-crime urban hotspots where the statistical chances of finding contraband were much higher, and applying it wholesale in a low-crime rural area like the outskirts of Prairie View A&M University in Texas. The context was completely wrong.
The tool didn't match the environment.
Exactly. The tactic was decoupled from the context where it might have been effective, or at least statistically justifiable. Applying it broadly was a misapplication of context, a failure of coupling. Then, Sandra Bland's demeanor during the stop, her understandable frustration, her questioning the reason for the stop, her agitated, jumpy, irritable responses, as Gladwell describes them, perhaps fueled by previous negative encounters with law enforcement. This demeanor was then tragically misinterpreted through the lens of police training that mistakenly assumes transparency. Officer Encina, operating under the friends fallacy, seemed to believe her reactions weren't just annoyance or fear, but were clear, transparent indicators that she was actively hiding something. Her lack of perfect compliance was read as guilt.
Instead of just someone having a bad day or being rightfully annoyed.
Or just asserting her rights or being confused or scared. Because he couldn't read her easily, because she wasn't transparently deferential in the way he expected, he defaulted to suspicion fueled by his training. This misinterpretation, this belief he could see guilt in her demeanor, led him to escalate the situation dramatically, demanding she put out her cigarette, ordering her out of the car, ultimately arresting her violently. Gladwell concludes, quite chillingly, that Sandra Bland's death is fundamentally what happens when a society does not know how to talk to strangers. And it raises this vital question for you to consider. When context is ignored, when coupling is disregarded, and when our flawed assumptions about transparency are blindly applied by those in authority, does even well-intentioned training become a recipe for disaster? Does it inevitably lead to profoundly eroded community trust and, in the worst cases, tragedy? It really underscores the immense, sometimes fatal impact of misinterpreting strangers within an inappropriate or misunderstood context.
That's a powerful and deeply relevant analysis, showing how these seemingly abstract psychological flaws and theories can manifest in devastating real-world consequences. It's not just academic. So, okay, we've covered our flawed default to truth, our mistaken assumptions about transparency, and the critical importance of context and coupling. What about other major factors that can significantly complicate our interactions with strangers, especially in social settings? Gladwell dives into something called myopia theory, concerning the effects of alcohol. This is a concept proposed, I believe, by Claude Steele and Robert Josephs. This theory, as I understand it, suggests that alcohol doesn't just make us reckless or lower inhibitions in a simple way. It primarily narrows our emotional and mental focus, making immediate experiences, immediate cues, disproportionately influential, while longer-term consequences or broader context just sort of fade from view. Is that the gist of it?
You've got it exactly right. And this theory represents a really important, nuanced shift in how we understand alcohol's impact on the brain and behavior. It effectively replaces the older, more simplistic disinhibition theory, which largely just suggested alcohol merely lowers our inhibitions, like flipping a switch, and makes us do things we secretly want to do but wouldn't dare do sober. Here's where it gets really interesting and more complex. Myopia theory posits that alcohol doesn't just disinhibit, it fundamentally alters how we perceive and prioritize information. It induces a kind of cognitive nearsightedness, hence myopia. Physiologically, it dampens activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain responsible for executive functions, higher-order thinking like attention, long-term planning, risk assessment, impulse control, understanding social cues.
The rational part of the brain.
The rational planning part, yes. Simultaneously, it can affect the amygdala, our brain's reaction and emotion center, making us more prone to immediate, intense, unmediated emotional responses. So, in essence, alcohol makes us, as Gladwell puts it rather bluntly, a bit dumber. It makes us significantly more reactive to the most immediate, salient stimuli in our environment, while ignoring broader context, potential future consequences, or subtle social signals. This impairment in processing nuance and foresight dramatically increases the risk of profound misunderstandings and misjudgments, especially in ambiguous or complex social situations involving strangers where the social roles might already be unclear or unspoken. You become fixated on the most obvious, immediate cues, maybe a smile, maybe a touch, often missing the vital, subtle signals or the bigger picture that are crucial for navigating complex social interactions safely and appropriately.
That's a profound shift in understanding. It's not just about being less inhibited, it's about this cognitive narrowing, this myopia. And it's not just about impaired judgment in the moment either. Gladwell goes on to explain how alcohol impacts memory and perception quite severely, particularly focusing on the hippocampus, the brain region that plays a crucial role in forming new memories, in encoding experiences. What happens there when someone drinks heavily, and what are the implications of that, especially when interacting with strangers later on?
Yes. This is where alcohol's effects become particularly insidious and potentially dangerous in social interactions, especially concerning issues like consent. Gladwell explains the science. At blood alcohol levels around 0.08%, which is the legal limit for driving in many places, the hippocampus starts to falter. Memory formation begins to become random, patchy, unreliable. At even higher levels, say around 0.15% and above, the hippocampus can effectively shut down entirely. It stops recording. This leads to what we commonly call blackouts, either fragmentary, where some spotty memories might return later, or en bloc, where there's a complete blank for a period of time.
Right, the morning after blank.
Exactly. Now here's the critical, often misunderstood, and deeply unsettling part. During a blackout, especially an en bloc blackout, other brain functions can remain surprisingly, deceptively normal. A person in a blackout might still be walking, talking, laughing, engaging in conversations, dancing, even making purchases or participating in complex social rituals. They might appear conscious and functional to a casual observer, even to a stranger interacting with them. Yet they will have absolutely no memory, zero recall of their actions, their words, or anything that happened during that blackout period later on. It's like the recording device was turned off. This makes it, as Gladwell stresses, really hard to tell just by looking at someone whether they've blacked out. There's no obvious outward sign.
That's terrifying.
It is, and this raises an immensely important, ethically complex, and difficult question for you, for society, to grapple with. If someone can appear to act normally, seem to participate, even seem to give consent during a blackout, how can genuine informed consent or even reliable intention be determined, either by them at the time or by the stranger they are interacting with, or even later by authorities? It creates this deeply ambiguous, ethically fraught, and often incredibly dangerous situation for everyone involved. It highlights just how radically alcohol can alter a person's presence, their understanding, and their ability to form memories within a social setting, making subsequent interpretation of events incredibly problematic.
That truly complicates any interaction involving alcohol and strangers, especially in environments where heavy drinking is common, like college parties. And Gladwell, quite controversially, uses the Brock-Turner sexual assault case at Stanford University to illustrate some of these complex points about alcohol, myopia, blackouts, and misinterpretations between strangers. This was, as many listeners will remember, the widely publicized case where Turner, a Stanford swimmer, sexually assaulted an unconscious woman, Chanel Miller, behind a dumpster outside a fraternity party. How does Gladwell use this incredibly sensitive and charged case to further his arguments about myopia theory and the difficulties of talking to strangers under these conditions?
Right, and it's crucial to state up front that Gladwell approaches the Brock-Turner case not to excuse Turner's actions or minimize the assault, but rather to shine a harsh analytical light on the constellation of systemic factors and cognitive impairments, particularly alcohol-induced myopia and potential blackouts that contribute to such tragic misunderstandings and violations, especially between strangers under the influence. He uses it as a case study, albeit a deeply disturbing one, to illustrate how alcohol's myopic effect can dramatically complicate interactions between strangers, especially in chaotic environments like fraternity parties where social norms, expectations, and rules about consent might already be dangerously blurry, poorly communicated, or even implicitly disregarded. Gladwell suggests, provocatively, that asking a drunk and immature 19-year-old and by extension perhaps, any young person in such a profoundly altered state, to accurately make sense of a stranger's desires, intentions, and boundaries amidst what he calls hypersexualized chaos is essentially an invitation to disaster.
He's pointing to the environment and the state of mind as major contributing factors.
Exactly. His argument isn't focused solely on individual blame and isolation, though legal responsibility remains. He wants us to understand the complex, toxic cocktail of factors often at play in such campus situations. The alcohol-induced myopia that narrows focus and impairs judgment for everyone involved, the often ambiguous social cues, the lack of established clarity or reinforcement around enthusiastic consent in certain party cultures, and overlaying all of that, the general fundamental ineptitude we all have in accurately reading strangers, especially when impaired. Now, while this perspective has understandably faced significant criticism for potentially seeming to mitigate the perpetrator's responsibility or shift focus away from the victim's experience, Gladwell's stated intent seems to be to push us, the readers, to analyze the entire situation, the environment, the context, the altered states of mind involved, moving beyond simple narratives of individual malice to understand the systemic vulnerabilities and psychological factors that can lead to such profound and devastating misinterpretations and violations between strangers. He wants us to see the bigger, more complicated, and frankly, more uncomfortable picture, even when that picture involves horrific acts.
That's a crucial clarification of his intent. And it's clear that Gladwell isn't trying to absolve individuals legally or morally, but rather to expand our understanding of the complex, often systemic forces that are frequently at play in these terrible encounters between strangers. So as we bring our deep dive towards a close now, we've explored quite a landscape of human interaction flaws. We've looked at our inherent, often naive default to truth. We've examined the illusions we cling to about transparency, the idea that we can easily read others, and we've seen the powerful, often overlooked role of context, coupling, and even substances like alcohol in shaping behavior and perception. It paints a rather stark picture, doesn't it, when you put it all together? A picture of a species that's compelled by the very nature of our modern interconnected world to constantly talk to strangers, yet simultaneously we seem fundamentally terrible at it, as Gladwell bluntly puts it, due to these deeply ingrained psychological defaults and blind spots.
It truly does paint a stark and perhaps humbling picture.
Yes.
And the overarching paradox that Gladwell presents throughout the book is profound and maybe a bit unsettling. We are obligated, virtually required, to interact with strangers constantly for society to function. Yet our inherent hardwiring, our tendency to assume truth, our misplaced belief in transparency, and our frequent disregard for critical context makes us fundamentally ill-equipped, almost designed for failure in many of these essential encounters. And when things inevitably go wrong, as they so often do in interactions with strangers, our knee-jerk reaction, our societal reflex, is almost always to blame the stranger.
Point the finger.
Point the finger. We attribute their actions, or our misinterpretation of their actions, to their inherent badness, their incompetence, their malice, or some flaw within them. We rarely look inward at our own flawed assumptions or outward at the context. We fail to acknowledge what Gladwell repeatedly calls the collective failure, a failure rooted not just in individual error, but in our deeply flawed shared social strategies and systemic assumptions about how communication with strangers works, or should work. He even makes the point that our very requirement for humanity in vital systems like justice or employment interviews or security screenings, our desire to rely on human judgment rather than just algorithms or rigid rules, means that we must, by necessity, tolerate an enormous amount of error. It's an uncomfortable trade-off that we rarely consciously acknowledge, but one that has immense, far-reaching consequences.
That's a heavy realization. That error is almost built into the system because we rely on flawed human judgment. So if we're so fundamentally bad at this, and just blaming the stranger isn't the solution, what's Gladwell's ultimate prescription? What's the takeaway? He certainly doesn't suggest we should just abandon trust entirely or become cynical and paranoid about everyone we meet, because as we discuss, that would lead to a completely paralyzed, dysfunctional society. Instead, he proposes we approach interactions with strangers with, and these are his key words, caution and humility. But what does that practically entail for us, for you listening? What does that caution and humility look like in everyday action?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? And Gladwell's prescription isn't a neat set of 5 easy steps to instantly read minds or become a human lie detector, precisely because his fundamental argument is that we can't truly read strangers perfectly. That goal is illusory. Instead, the solution, or perhaps the path toward fewer disastrous misunderstandings, lies in a profound shift in our mindset. It's less about becoming better at judging others, and more about cultivating a deeper introspection and empathy regarding our own limitations, our own biases, our own defaults. Caution and humility mean consciously approaching these encounters with strangers armed with an awareness of our own inherent psychological blind spots, the ones we've talked about today. It means accepting the fundamental limits of our ability to truly decipher strangers, to know their real intentions with certainty, or to accurately interpret their often ambiguous outward behavior. Gladwell urges you, the reader, the listener, to acknowledge that you will never know the whole truth about a stranger. And that paradoxically, sometimes the harder you push to extract that definitive truth, especially by demanding transparency, assuming deception, or applying pressure, the more elusive and distorted that truth can become. You might actually damage the very fragile information you're seeking by trying too hard.
So it's about managing our own expectations and assumptions more than managing the stranger.
Exactly. It's internal work first. So practically, this involves a few key things you can try to incorporate. First, it means building in a conscious pause, a moment of reflection, before making immediate, definitive judgments about someone's character, their honesty, or their intentions based solely on their initial demeanor or their first few words. Resist the snap judgment. Second, it means making a deliberate effort to actively consider the context, the stranger's world, the situation they are in, before attributing blame or intent solely to them. Ask yourself, is this person acting this way because of who they inherently are, or could it be because of the specific situation they're currently navigating, the pressures they're under, the environment, or even an altered state of mind like intoxication or extreme stress? Third, it's about maintaining an awareness that your own default to truth and your belief in transparency can be exploited. So, a healthy, reasoned skepticism, not cynicism, but careful consideration is warranted, especially in high-stakes scenarios or when something feels off, without immediately jumping to accusation.
It's about questioning our first impressions more critically.
Questioning our impressions, questioning the situation. If we connect this to the bigger picture for you, it means cultivating a mindset of deep curiosity, but perhaps shifting that curiosity slightly. Less curiosity about definitively knowing the person, is this person good or bad? And more curiosity about understanding the situation. What is happening here? What factors are influencing this interaction? It requires a conscious, continuous effort to challenge your own ingrained assumptions, your defaults. It fundamentally transforms how you might engage with every unfamiliar face, prompting you to recognize that every interaction holds far more complexity, more hidden variables, and vastly more potential for misunderstanding than you might initially perceive. At the end of the day, it's about striving to be more careful, more thoughtful, more aware of complexity, and ultimately perhaps more compassionate and understanding in our increasingly interconnected, stranger-filled world.
This was it on today's book, guys. Kindly subscribe and follow us for more rich insights on various books, and also do not forget to join our social media community to stay in touch and get updated.
Given how deeply ingrained our tendencies to assume truth and transparency really are, and how profoundly context shapes behavior in ways we often miss, maybe consider this as you go about your day. What subtle yet potentially critical misunderstandings might be unfolding in your own daily interactions, especially with those people you don't know, well, colleagues, neighbors, service staff, simply because you're unconsciously assuming they're an open book, easily readable, operating in a familiar setting you think you fully understand what might be missing.